And hello, everybody. You're very welcome to a new Redefining CyberSecurity podcast here on ITSPmagazine. This is Sean Martin, your host, where if you listen to the show, you know I get to talk to loads of cool people about cool things, ultimately helping businesses and their teams bring security into the fold in a way that enables business and drives value for customers, not just reduce risk, but hopefully generate revenue and protect it in the process. And I'm thrilled to have Julie Haney on, who joins me as a co-host for the sub-series, and I'm thrilled to see you again, Julie. It's been a few weeks. It's good to have you.
Yeah, it's been a few months. We've both been pretty busy and traveling.
A busy summer, doing good stuff, hopefully on both sides. And this is all rooted in the research of, obviously, as it says in the title, human-centered cybersecurity. So not just the tech, but how do we understand who we are as humans, and what that means using tech, and what that means protecting ourselves with technology. And it's not magic, right? This is research driven by people understanding how people work. And I'm going to leave it to you, Julie, to kind of introduce our guest today.
Great. Thanks, Sean. So I am excited that today we have as our guest Nadine Michaelides. Nadine is a security and crime psychologist. She's a researcher at University College London. She's a speaker and an entrepreneur. So she has tons of free time, no doubt. And I met Nadine maybe about a year ago, give or take, and we had a great discussion about the work that she's doing, which is absolutely fascinating. It's rooted in psychology. It's evidence-based and has real practical applicability to organizations today. So welcome, Nadine. Glad to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So one of the things that I find absolutely fascinating is that I've been meeting more and more people who are working in cybersecurity, but they started off in a completely different discipline. But now they're in the field and they're bringing these great skills that they learned in these other disciplines. And you are one of those people, Nadine, where you didn't start off in cybersecurity. So can you tell us a little bit about your professional journey? How did you get to where you are now?
Yes, of course. So I started out as an undergrad in psychology, and then essentially went into stakeholder engagement and communications around big digital transformations, big projects. So national healthcare projects in the UK, we have the National Health Service, which is a public sector healthcare organisation. And so myself, as a consultant, was responsible for the people aspect of the project, which can make or break them. We're talking about multi-billion-pound projects, mergers, acquisitions, consolidation of services, a lot of digital transformation. And without the people, those projects would collapse. So the methodologies that I would use were very much employee-focused. So we would use psychological methodologies. Also looking at sort of employee feedback was a major thing that we rolled out across England, so that we could really gauge the level of the experience that patients and employees were having and what impact that had on these projects. So I started very much out in a different world, not a cybersecurity world, more around healthcare, but with very similar problems. How do we engage people? How do we motivate them for change when it feels uncomfortable? There was a lot of redundancies and changes of ways of working that people were not necessarily embracing and open to. So it becomes a way of how can we influence without it being a top-down approach, but more of a kind of bottom-up, on a level playing field approach. So I ended up actually in cybersecurity only about 5 years ago, and it was when I decided I was going to go back to education and do 3 master's degrees, actually. And the first one was investigative journalism, just because it was beginning of COVID times. I was feeling pretty like I wanted to do something a little bit different. And I ended up in this journalism project with Uppdrag Granskning, which is kind of Panorama, UK would call it Panorama, but a secret investigative project. And the focus was on surveillance, drug cartels, and cybersecurity. So I was working with these cybersecurity agencies, and I realized that actually that the problems that they were facing in being able to secure these organizations from harm was very much related to human factors and this people aspect that I've been dealing with for very many years. And I really felt that organizational psychology, or otherwise known as business psychology or occupational psychology, could offer a lot of value in helping to engage, motivate, and understand the people factor. And therefore protect those organizations from harm. So I then went on to do another master's degree in organizational psychology and engage University College London as part of a PhD doctorate, and continue that education while simultaneously working with security professionals to understand what the issues were and what kind of methodologies were around in research that could help mitigate some of that risk from a human factors perspective.
It's fascinating for sure. And I'm excited to dig into it. I know Julie's probably going to take us here kind of deeper into some of that research, but I want to ask this question about the work that you've done over the last few years. When we talk cybersecurity, we tend to have conversations that everything's constantly changing. The threat actors are changing, their objectives are changing, the tech stack is changing, business capabilities are changing. A lot of change here. So one, like a layman myself, one might think, well, the human is kind of static. Our makeup is our makeup. But then you mentioned during COVID times you wanted to change the things up a little bit and look at different things, which leads me to think, well, maybe we're always changing as well. So I don't know, your thoughts on that in terms of how that fits into society and how that might affect how we approach some of this stuff from a cybersecurity perspective.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question that I've never been asked before, actually, but it's spot on. It's so change management and methodologies around change management are very much appropriate for this as well. So managing the people aspect of change, because people respond to change in very different ways. Some people are very reluctant or resistant, and some people embrace it and are torchbearers of change and create change and love change. So understanding those sorts of different characteristics of human beings can help you understand how people will relate to that change. Because essentially cybersecurity behaviors, which is what we want all employees to do, rely on employees changing in some way. So it's not just about changing whether they change their passwords, it's changing their mindset towards security and cybersecurity. So we need them to have this mindset that they care about their organization's well-being, their own well-being, their team's well-being. And part of that is about security of that organization and adopting certain behaviors. So change is extremely relevant, and it's something that's been studied for many, many years in psychology and a big part of my research. But actually a layer below that, which is even more critical than the change, which is essentially still a surface level phenomenon, is motivation. So motivation is the core aspect of my particular research in this area, and also the psychometrics that I've developed at University College London, and as part of the work that I do from a practitioner point of view in my company. So essentially, it's change is important. How we respond to change is very important. How other people respond to change, and understanding how whole teams respond. So there's something called the psychological contract, and that is a psychological phenomenon which has been tested since the 1990s. And that is, I won't go too much into the psychology of it because not everyone is a psychologist and wants to know the detail, but essentially it's those sort of extra factors. So rather than what's in black and white on a work contract, it's those sort of other expectations that we have around our employment. So it could be that we expect that if we work really hard and excel in what we're doing, that we may get promoted, or that we may get a salary rise of some sort. Or it could be that you expect to be treated as a valuable human being and employee as part of your career, and your manager should be respectful of you. So these are expectations that we have, and when that's very positive, when that relationship with your employer and the organization is very positive, it promotes these positive attitudes and positive behaviors. When it becomes negative, when that psychological contract breach occurs and we have a breakdown in expectations between the employer and the employee, it creates disgruntlement, it creates maliciousness, this sort of not necessarily intentional harm against the organization, but layers below that, which is not dissimilar from the change methodologies and our approach to change, in the sense of the way we may be reluctant or resistant to adopting security behaviors or change. So it's not necessarily malicious. So essentially what I do is I as part of my research, and also what I do in my daily work, is I move away from this perspective that there's unintentional and intentional insider threat, or lack of engagement or engagement with security, and towards the 1,000 shades of grey that are in between unintentional and intentional. So we're moving away from good and bad apples and more into really understanding the employee, the individual employee, and how do they relate to the rest of their teams and their organization through employee feedback loops, through psychometrics, through understanding organizational factors that may exist within the organization that may predetermine behavior. So it can be basic things like encryption tools are not enabling employees to fulfill the needs of their jobs, particularly if they're, for example, I'm thinking back to one of the big projects I worked for, the UK bank. If they are high net worth individuals, that their clients are high net worth individuals, and their VIP account managers and their responsibility are to provide an exemplary service, and yet there are all these barriers in place. So they become barriers to them being able to fulfill the needs of their job and fulfill the needs of their clients. So these are organizational factors as well, which are really important. So yes, that's a long answer to your short question, but change is a fundamental part, and how we respond to change is incredibly important when we look at the human-centered security aspect.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I know our initial discussion about the psychological contract really, I mean, that really drew me in, because it makes sense that when people are kind of disgruntled with their employer, they're not going to necessarily go above and beyond to take these extra security actions. That is really, not necessarily part of their primary job. So, they don't have that incentive to do that. So, I mean, that was a fantastic overview of, some of the factors that are influencing employee engagement. So how are organizations doing with that? Are they recognizing these? What are they doing well, or what can they improve on when it comes to kind of their attitudes and their approaches about that human element of cybersecurity?
So that's a question which forces me to be positive rather than negative. So I like that. So I think what's been done really well over the last few years is this drive for awareness. Whilst I don't particularly enjoy the term awareness, because for me that's a very small nugget of the whole behavior change piece. It's probably the least important one, to be honest. It's a move away from technical security and into understanding the human factor. So the other good news is, whilst it takes some time to evolve, particularly when we have mainly technical people that are facilitating human-centered security, we've also moving slightly from my explanation and my discussions with practitioners, my feeling is we're moving away from awareness and more into human risk management. Now, I know there's a lot of grumpiness and a lot of discourse around should it be called human risk because employees shouldn't be put in negative light and all that sort of thing. But there's a very good reason for that, and that is because we can measure risk. It's hard to measure awareness, not in a way that matters, because awareness itself, I'm aware that I shouldn't eat chocolate. After this podcast, I'm probably going to go and buy some chocolate. It doesn't actually have that much influence on my behavior. And it's one metric, one superficial metric, a compliance rate, or did I do the quiz questions correctly? It doesn't really necessarily mean that I'm going to absorb that knowledge in a long-term memory, repeat those behaviors, completely irrelevant of my environment and what I feel about my organization and my employer. So absolutely. So aspects like motivation, as I already mentioned, Sean mentioned change, but also beyond that, we need to be thinking about, what do people think about security, commitment, loyalty, trust? What do they think about their organizations? And these are all very important factors. So that's kind of this appreciation of human-centered security and human factors is a wonderful development. I think the problem with this sort of approach right now is we still have technical people defining the scope for human factors or socio-technical security. And what's happening, what's booming in industry right now is you've got awareness solutions. So essentially content providers, people creating content, whether it's Hollywood movies or whether it's simply posters. You've got content providers managing human risk and creating human risk platforms. And it doesn't take a lot of logic to understand that obviously human risk is something that's extremely serious, that requires a multidisciplinary approach, that requires psychologists, sociologists, a variety of different people to understand. It's a holistic approach to human risk that we need. Otherwise, it becomes very dangerous. And when you have content creators with some CISOs creating understanding or creating human risk models, if you like, and defining scoring for individuals, that's kind of a dangerous way to go, really. So there's becoming an increasing need for understanding employees and their motivations and their perspectives. And we need a multidisciplinary approach for that, which includes psychologists, essentially. So lots of great stuff happening, but we really need to bring the right people in the room to create the right solutions.
Can I ask you this, Nadine? Because you talk about going to get chocolate. Chocolate wouldn't be my favorite thing. I love chocolate, but it wouldn't be the thing I go out. I leave the house to go get. Ice cream would be a different story. A nice gelato I'd love. And so there's risk health-wise to that, right? Cholesterol and putting on weight. So for me, I can make that risk assessment. I love that we're talking about risk here, by the way, whether we call it human risk or whatever. But I can make that assessment of I'm going to eat that ice cream, 3 scoops instead of 2, because I feel like it today. I want to treat myself. I will mitigate some of that risk by walking 15 miles today instead of 10, or hike 2 days this weekend instead of just 1. I can personally do some risk mitigation for myself, and in the business, they can put some mitigating, let's say, controls or other factors in to help mitigate the risk that the employee brings. But is there an opportunity to help the employee understand the risk?
So I think I caught most of that. So essentially, there are always mitigating factors and approaches that you can take when looking at human risk or any other psychological factor or human-centered factor around security. But essentially what we're trying to do is resonate with hearts and minds. And it's the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, which was another part of my research. So when you're dealing with extrinsic motivation, which is the majority of initiatives that security teams have, security champion initiatives or reward systems or awards. These are all extrinsic. So, we might see value in them because there's some sort of monetary value perhaps, or, just a pat on the back. But they tend to be quite short term and quite vulnerable to change. So, you might win an award one day, but the next day, if you have a breakdown in communication with your manager, then, you may be tempted still to do some harm against the organization in some way. Whereas if you're intrinsically motivated towards security, you're much less likely to do harm against that organization, even with a number of scenarios. So with intrinsic motivation, we are resonating with hearts and minds in a way that feels like it belongs part of us. So that's where we're able to understand how our own personal individual human risk relates to the organization, the team, and the organizational wider risk, and they become interconnected. So you as an individual, as an employee, don't just see yourself as a temporary contractor that's in it for transactional reasons for a definitive period of time, but you're actually in it because you see this organization as being of value to you, that you see this as a career, you see this as more of a long-term thing that you want to internalize. And that's when, through content, through initiatives, through how employees are treated, we can create this intrinsic motivation towards their security, but their wider organization. Mm-hmm. So it becomes less about trying to get people to do specific tasks and more about trying to bring them on the journey so that they understand why security is important, not just to the organization's so that they don't lose billions of dollars, but actually to themselves, an individual, in securing their jobs and being part of their career in the long term, and also the security aspects that they may bring home with them. If they bring a laptop home with them, or anything else. So making security relevant to that individual in a way that matters to them is really, really important. So one of the things I did when I was working with as the subject matter expert with the European Union Agency of Cybersecurity, ANISA, was look at cultural factors. Because, if you're creating content, for example, whether it's a Hollywood movie content or whether it's something a lot more simple, you have to make sure that it resonates with the cultural aspects of those individuals. So if it's a foreign language or it feels too American and they're from Africa, there's a barrier there to really appreciating and feeling inspired and involved with the content that's being shared with them. So it needs to be that kind of interactive, two-way appreciation for security that can be internalized. And in that way, individuals then, I think, would have more appreciation for that individual human risk, as well as how that relates to the wider organizational security posture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. It's all about making people feel like they're active and involved partners in security, whereas I think many in the cybersecurity community tend to view their users as, the weakest link or the enemy, or, it's kind of an us versus them type of situation, instead of saying, we're all partners in this. We all have to do our part. We all have some responsibility in this. So I completely agree. That's where we want to ideally be. So you started to mention something about, kind of taking in the kind of cultural factors in mind when you are trying to get employees engaged. What are some other ways that you would recommend that organizations try to engage their employees more in cybersecurity?
So when I was in stakeholder engagement and communications, I always used to use inform, involve, and inspire. It's going back a few years ago now, and it's not something I use now, particularly on a daily basis. But what we do as content creators is we inform people and we assume that they will understand that material, that it will resonate, that they will remember it, and they will utilize it in a positive way at some point later down the line. The next layer above that is to involve them in it. So that's how we get this more interactive discussion. They are involved in the journey. It's not just top down. We're actually in some way, whether it's through discussion, whether it's through using VR instead of using videos, we're in some way finding a way to involve. And then we have the best way of doing things, which is to inspire. And that comes down to this intrinsic motivation again. We want to inspire individuals to care about security, and they have to understand why it's important and what impact counterproductive behavior, which is very much a psychological term that we can measure and has been studied for many years, how counterproductive behavior can have an impact on the security posture and also themselves as individuals within that macrocosm, that organization. So stakeholder engagement is very, very important. But I mean, we're talking a lot about research and academia and science and psychology, which is incredibly important before rolling anything out when it comes to security. But some of this is extremely logical. It's very logical. I mean, it's employee feedback. If you want to understand where the problems are within an organization and why people are disengaged, why they're not doing the security training videos, or why they're not changing their passwords, you just need to ask them. It's quite simple, really. It might be very simple reasons why they're not. It could be, of course, insider threat or some sort of foreign threat actor, espionage. It could be as serious as that, but equally, it could be very simple and very, very easy for the security teams to change in order to increase behavior in a positive way. So these employee feedback loops are extremely important, and these days so easy to do with AI and NLP and sentiment analysis. We can get a lot of intelligence and insights before we've even recruited people, right from the recruitment and selection stage. We can get a lot of data and intelligence, which then defines what the security teams need to do, where the hotspots are in the organization, where they need to tailor and focus their initiatives on. So we need to move away from this one-size-fits-all approach. Everybody needs to do the same 3-minute videos, the same questions. Everybody hates them, because ultimately it's not part of their job description. It's not part of their bonus structures. So why should they take time out of their day to do something that they don't enjoy and feels irrelevant? So we need to move away from that and more to bespoke, tailored solutions which resonate, which those individuals understand. Well, actually, yeah, this makes sense to me. I've taken, perhaps I've done some assessments, and I can see where my gaps in knowledge are, or potential issues that might happen if I don't do certain training or have certain initiatives to mitigate risk in some way. So it's about this. Bottom up approach rather than top down. Starting employee focused solutions are the only way to go to keep that stakeholder and get that employee engagement carrying on.
Yeah, I love that the spoke, because as you were talking, I was thinking engineers look at things differently than somebody in marketing, than somebody in finance, than sales, right? And just go down the list. And then even just generational, because you use the word, well, the objective is to kind of bring the employees in to feel like they're part of the organization. But some of the latest generations like transactional type activity. They want to take the Uber. They don't want to own a car or have a driver's license, right? They like that transactional type of engagement in many cases. So how do we, it could be an endless matrix of bespoke content. How do we get a handle on what to present to whom and know that it will stick?
Well, I mean, you can measure it. There are measurements that you can, you're talking about several different kind of metrics there. If you're trying to understand whether it's stuck up here, then what you would do if you're talking about the individual or you're talking about a whole nation. So with October Cybersecurity Month, when I was working with Anisa, you're talking about 26 member states. How do we know? How do we evidence the fact that all this taxpayers' money that's pumped into radio, TV, and various different types of content is actually having a positive impact on citizens around Europe? And so we were actually able to measure that, and thankfully it did have a successful impact. So the ROI was effective. So there are definitely ways that you can measure whether your initiatives have had an impact and stuck. It's just a case of having the either the team expertise or the functionality to be able to do that. And I very strongly advise people to do that. I mean, unfortunately, the awareness market has become a bit of a market for lemons, which was a philosopher back some years ago, but that defined it in that way. And it's become a bit of a tick box exercise for people without much thought about the why and the impact and whether it's had a positive impact or not. So I think if we get back down to that employee focused security and finding those ways of getting employee feedback, then we have a better chance of preventing this one-size-fits-all approach, which doesn't resonate, doesn't have an impact, and doesn't stick, and doesn't create behavioral change impact.
Yeah, the employee feedback is something that I recommend, and it's very interesting because security professionals are kind of caught off guard, like, oh, we never thought about going to the people that are actually having the struggles and talking to them. But I wonder sometimes if employees are hesitant to provide that feedback, especially if it might shed some light on maybe some workarounds that they're doing that that they shouldn't be doing, or or it kind of admits that they don't know what's going on. Maybe they didn't pay attention to the training. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about is in safety, we have the safety privilege, right? There's a lot of organizations trying to create a culture of safety and saying, if you come forward and you talk about something, you're not going to get in trouble for it. And I often wonder if we should have something like cyber privilege in that respect. I mean, in your experience, have you seen that employees might be hesitant to talk about some of the security problems that they're having?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But particularly when you're asking direct questions, you're talking about self-reported questionnaires there, where people are expected to give you the answers you want, but invariably will optimize that to suit their own benefits, or perhaps out of fear of upsetting someone. So there's lots of reasons why it might prevent them from telling the truth. But essentially, that's what psychology is here for. They have spent many, many years in finding ways of analyzing employee feedback and analyzing textual or numerical values to get enriched intelligence from that, which kind of gets away from this self-reported ability to be manipulated or manipulate other people. So one of the ways in which I address that through my research is using situational judgment tests, which has been used by the military in the US and UK for many, many, many years. And that is assessing how do people respond to different scenarios. So how are they likely to behave given a certain scenario, which in the military or some sort of security services is very relevant, because if someone gets shot at the end of the street and that person responsible for resolving that situation runs away in the opposite direction, you kind of need to know that as part of the recruitment process. So this is an example. If you were to ask that individual, what would you do if someone gets shot down the street? They're going to say, oh, I would, of course, I would go straight to them and go and help, blah, blah, blah. But there are ways in which psychological methodologies and other approaches in science can help really get down to the truth of what people would really do in these different scenarios. And situational judgment tests is a really great way of doing that. And the other reason why I like them so much is it creates profiles that are based on values. So there's no right or wrong. Personality is quite, it changes depending, well, from one situation to another situation. So you can do the same personality test at 2 p.m. and it will be very different to what it's like at 5 p.m. When it's values based and it's going through different scenarios where you're having to think about how you would respond in these different scenarios, it becomes more stable over a long period of time. And it creates more insights of understanding people rather than calling them good or bad apples, essentially.
That's so super cool. I'd love to dig into that. I don't think we have time to do that, but I have one more question. It may be connected, actually. Well, certainly connected to the last point that was made around measuring success. But there was a term in some of the notes, psychometrics. So can you explain what that is? Is it related to what we were just talking about, or what is it and how does it fit in, and what do people need to know for?
Yeah, of course. I mean, people get a little bit scared when you say psychometrics, and there's been from a marketing perspective, a lot of talk. Should it be psychological assessments? Should it be human risk assessments? Should it be psychometric? I mean, essentially, yes, the situational judgment test that I'm talking about was part of a project called Project Athena, which was part of my doctorate and is psychometrics, which help to analyze security posture within organization from an individual, if they should want it, but also wider hotspots within the organization. So psychometrics doesn't have to be scary at all. It can be very much values based, and it can be very much about, well, how would you respond in these different situations? And actually, when we use the term psychometrics, we're also including aspects like training needs assessments, like cultural factors within organizations. So security culture, security values, in fact, even net promoter score. So a whole heap of different kind of metrics, and we're putting it in the psychometrics box, but just to try and ring home how important it is to understand these psychological aspects or nuanced aspects that may exist in the organization, the socio side of technical. And so that's why we've created, or Angela Sassi, which is my supervisor at UCL, created the term socio-technical security. And I think that's a great way of putting it on a level playing field. Oh, you lost me for a minute.
Yeah, we did. You just mentioned Angela.
Oh, okay, right. So I was just saying that she's my supervisor at UCL, and she created the term of socio-technical security, which puts the social and the technical on a level playing field, which I think is a healthy way to address security and consider human factors. And human-centered security is another great term, of course.
Great. Awesome. This has been an amazing conversation, Nadine. Absolutely fascinating. I love understanding more about the psychology behind security and how organizations can better engage their employees. So we're gonna wrap up now. Thank you so much again for being on the podcast. And Sean, I'll leave it to you to take it away.
You always bring amazing topics and guests to have great chats with, Julie. So I'm grateful for that. And Nadine, it's a pleasure meeting you and having this conversation. It's making my brain go 100 miles an hour here, for sure. Hopefully the audience is picking up on a few things. And of course, we'll leave links to your profile so folks can connect with you if they have questions about the research you've done and how it might help them and impact their own programs in their organization. Julie, it's always a pleasure. Human-centered cybersecurity, an important thing. It's not just about the tech, and I'm honored to host this series alongside you, or you hosted along with me. However you want to look at it.
No, it's the opposite. You're definitely the host.
Oh, no.
Thank you, Sean.
I want to thank everybody for listening and watching, and be sure to subscribe and share, and stay tuned for more here on Redefining Cybersecurity. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.